In Athens, punishment could be bought for the price of a radish. Not a sword, not a chain, a vegetable from the market. A woman is dragged through the Agora, her crime announced to strangers adultery. There will be no trial. No defense, only laughter. A radish forced into her body before the crowd becomes the symbol of justice. They call it purification. They call it order. But who decided that humiliation was cheaper than law? The chronicles are silent, yet the stones of the Agora still remember. If you value the record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. Athens liked to imagine itself as the mind of the ancient world, a place where reason ruled and democracy reigned. But its streets told a different truth. It began as all moral spectacles did in public. The condemned woman, wife, concubine, or slave was brought to the center of the Agora. Her clothes were torn, her name was shouted. The magistrate did not speak of law, but of pollution. Miasma, the invisible disorder believed to infect the city, when a woman broke the moral code. What followed was not justice. It was purification through humiliation. A ritual in which the body was the stage and shame the offering. This is the paradox that haunts Greek civilization. The birthplace of philosophy could also be the workshop of humiliation. The same thinkers who spoke of virtue and moderation watched as virtue was enforced through degradation. They called it deterrence. They called it balance. But beneath the rhetoric of wisdom lay a simple equation. Shame was cheaper than mercy. When the act ended, there was no applause, only silence, the sound of a crowd satisfied that order had been restored. The woman was taken away, nameless, faceless, erased from history. The Agora returned to its trade, its debates, its theatre. The city convincing itself once again that cruelty was reason, and reason was civilization. In Athens, humiliation was not spontaneous, it was documented. Behind every public disgrace stood a clerk, stylus in hand, wax tablet on lap recording not emotion but transaction. The system needed proof receipts, witnesses. Shame had to be measured to be legitimate. In the city that birthed democracy, even dishonor required paperwork. A magistrate's verdict began not with the punishment, but with an entry. The accused's name, the infraction, the fine. A woman exposed for adultery owed both her dignity and a fee. A debtor flogged in the Agora paid with his blood and his drachma. Every humiliation had a price tag, every act of pain an assigned value. The Greeks had turned disgrace into currency, an economy of virtue where the state profited from the sins it condemned. This was not chaos, it was administration. The court, scribes, not the executioners, ensured that shame flowed efficiently through the city's veins. Fines became part of civic revenue. Tax collectors processed penalties as routinely as grain levies. Even the public herald, who announced a citizen's disgrace, received payment from the condemned's property. It was bureaucracy, as moral theatre. Each act of degradation logged, sealed, and balanced. The people watched. The ledgers recorded. Athens kept its soul tidy through bookkeeping. But beneath this neatness lay something far more profound. When humiliation is quantified, it becomes predictable. And predictability means control. The Greeks discovered that order did not need to come from swords or chains, it could emerge from records. A citizen who knew the price of shame would fear it more than death. pain is temporary, inscription is eternal. Once entered in the civic role's disgrace could outlive its victim, carried forward by gossip, inscription, and rumour. Athenian law called it atimia, the loss of civic honour. One could be alive yet erased from society's moral economy. You could no longer vote, testify, or enter the Agora as a peer. In that sense, atimia was both a punishment and a deletion. It transformed the living into ghosts of the state. And like all bureaucratic ghosts, their existence was proven only by absence, a blank line in the ledger where a name should have been. The machinery of shame ran on precision. Witnesses swore oaths. Fines were scaled by rank and gender. A woman's public exposure carried different penalties than a man's insult to authority, but both were priced, filed, and preserved in stone inscriptions. What we call justice was for the Greeks a kind of accounting, a moral audit, where the body and soul were items on a balance sheet. The gods might weigh hearts, but Athens weighed reputation. This system also made cruelty efficient. A single act of punishment could fund the very bureaucracy that performed it. The executioner was paid from the condemned's estate. The temple that hosted the trial received offerings of forfeited goods. The moral order thus sustained itself. Humiliation became self-financing. The city's virtue ran on revenue. And yet, this meticulous record-keeping masked a deeper paradox. By recording shame, the Greeks preserved it. Every tablet, every decree, every carved sentence ensured that the punished could never escape memory. The archive was not redemption, it was eternal exposure. Even now, archaeologists read the same lists Demetrios fined for seduction, Callisto stripped of honor, Phanius branded for theft. The handwriting has faded, but the logic has not. The ledger of dishonor was more than a document. It was a mirror. It reflected a society obsessed with transparency, with seeing and being seen. The Greeks feared secrecy because secrecy meant autonomy. To live unseen was to live outside the polis, and that was worse than death. The bureaucrat's stylus, therefore, did more than record it disciplined. Each entry reminded citizens that every act could be traced, priced, and immortalized. And in that quiet moment, as the scribe etched another line of shame, the city achieved something terrifying. A moral economy so efficient, it no longer required cruelty to function. The threat of visibility was enough. The punishment had become psychological, invisible, bureaucratic, and therefore unstoppable. To the Greeks, the body was not merely flesh. It was geometry, harmony, divine arithmetic, a visible fragment of cosmic order. The sculptors of Athens carved muscle, as philosophy sinew, as proof of logic. The body mirrored the universe. Balance of limb reflected balance of law. To damage that harmony was not only cruelty, it was sacrilege. The Greeks did not simply punish a person. They disrupted a miniature cosmos. Every cut, burn, or exposure carried metaphysical weight. When a woman was stripped in the Agora, it was not just skin that was revealed, it was disorder unveiled. Her shame was seen as contagion, her exposure a warning that moral chaos had entered the public square. The same logic applied to men. A citizen flogged before the assembly was not punished for pain's sake, but for imbalance. His body now marked as proof of his inner failure. The Greeks believed that to live well was to live kolos kagathos beautifully and rightly. Punishment then was the restoration of symmetry through degradation. The philosophers rationalized this brutality with elegance. Plato spoke of the soul and body as intertwined instruments. When one strayed, the other must be tuned, even if by force. Aristotle justified public correction as civic hygiene. The state, like a physician, must purge the infected. The crowd that watched a beating believed they were witnessing purification, not cruelty. It was religion disguised as justice. Temples too carried this theology of flesh. Statues of gods stood as perfect bodies, proportion, grace, serenity. Against this marble ideal, human imperfection became visible and shameful. A bruised back, a shaved head, a branded thigh. These were not only signs of guilt, but of cosmic deviation. Punishment was less about restoring law than restoring order in the eyes of heaven. Consider the rituals surrounding the punished. Before exposure, the accused was often washed in sacred water. Afterward, the space they occupied was cleansed again, not for hygiene, but for spiritual containment. Their imperfection had contaminated the city's geometry. The priest did not heal wounds, he restored alignment. Even dirt had metaphysics. This obsession with harmony transformed aesthetics into moral control. The citizen's duty was to appear balanced, to walk, speak, and even gesture with measured grace. An unshapely body implied moral disorder. A scar invited judgment. In a society where beauty equaled virtue, punishment struck at both. A disfigured face meant a disordered soul. The law, therefore, could use pain to prove its philosophy. And so, punishment became an act of divine mimicry. Judges and priests played at being gods, deciding whose flesh still deserved to mirror the eternal. In their hands, the whip and branding iron were not instruments of cruelty, but of correction tools to reassert cosmic hierarchy. Each scar inscribed the lesson that the body did not belong to the self. It belonged to the city, and through the city to the divine. This logic reached its cruelest refinement in the punishment of women. Their bodies were symbols of fertility, beauty, and divine favor. Yet, that same sanctity made them dangerous. A woman accused of adultery or immodesty did not just violate her husband. She violated the cosmic balance between purity and decay. Her punishment was therefore a ritual sacrifice, the shaving of hair, the exposure of skin, the public stripping of sacred order. The crowd was not meant to feel pity, they were meant to witness purification. The paradox is brutal. The Greeks elevated the body to the realm of gods, then used that elevation to justify its desecration. To scar the flesh was to rewrite the cosmos. To brand a name into skin was to remind the victim that even the divine symmetry could be harnessed for control. And through this, Athens perfected its theology of punishment. Justice was no longer separate from beauty. It required beauty. Every act of degradation had to be seen balanced and aesthetically composed. The alignment of marble columns echoed in the alignment of the punished body upright, centered, framed by the watching crowd. This is why Greek cruelty feels so dissonant to us. It wasn't rage, it was ritual. Pain had choreography, humiliation had symmetry, even agony had proportion. In the perfection of punishment, they saw proof of civilization. Athenian justice did not whisper in back rooms. It echoed through marble. Trials were not held in dim cells or hidden chambers, but in temples, sanctuaries of order, where the accused stood beneath the unblinking gaze of the gods. Imagine the light columns casting geometric shadows across a trembling figure, statues of Athena and Apollo gazing down as silent jurors. the message was unmistakable. Judgment did not belong to men alone. It was divine geometry enacted in stone. In this architecture, fear became faith. Every pillar, every carved frieze served as a moral reminder. Symmetry equals purity. Imbalance demands correction. The defendant, standing barefoot on cool marble, could feel the weight of both civic and celestial authority pressing down. The gods were the architecture, and the architecture was the verdict. There was no escape from beauty. It surrounded, measured, and condemned. The temples of Athens were not merely places of worship, they were instruments of discipline. The court of the Areopagus, perched on its rocky hill, was more shrine than courthouse. Its steps were worn by generations of defendants climbing toward their fate. The very climb was symbolic ascent toward light revelation exposure. To reach judgment, one had to rise into visibility. The Greeks built their justice to be seen. Secrecy was corruption. Exposure was virtue. A private trial was a contradiction in terms. The law, like the gods, required witnesses. Every element of design enforced submission. The high ceilings made men feel small. The echoing walls amplified confessions into eternity. Even the ritual-seating magistrates elevated spectators arranged in semicircles, turned justice into theatre. The audience's eyes became extensions of the law. The accused was already half condemned simply by being visible. This was architecture as psychology. It didn't only frame justice, it programmed obedience. To enter such a space was to internalize hierarchy. The columns were not decoration, they were sermons in stone. Their perfect alignment preached civic order, their permanence whispered inevitability. You will die, but the city will remain. Athenians called their city the School of Greece, but its lessons were written not in scrolls, in shadow steps and sightlines. To kneel beneath the marble body of Athena, Parthenos was to kneel beneath the embodiment of law itself, intellect, discipline, restraint. Every defendant's trembling voice echoed under her gaze, each syllable reverberating through the temple, as if into judgment itself. The gods did not need to speak. The architecture spoke for them. And yet, in this fusion of divinity and law, something monstrous emerged. When beauty legitimizes power, mercy becomes deformation. Compassion feels like imperfection. The symmetry of marble demanded symmetrical justice. Precise, impersonal, and absolute. The very perfection of the space forbade empathy. The crowd believed the punishment beautiful because the temple was beautiful. They mistook harmony for morality. That is the psychology of empire. Make cruelty architectural, and it will feel sacred. The more elegant the setting, the less barbaric the act appears. A flogging under columns becomes purification, not violence. A public confession under the statue of Athena becomes philosophy, not humiliation. The Greeks invented the aesthetics of obedience, and the world has never quite escaped it. This design of fear did not vanish with time. Roman basilicas borrowed the same geometry for their trials, and later Christian cathedrals transformed judgment into confession, the same ritual transposed from marble to faith. Even our modern courthouses echo the same proportions: high ceilings, stone facades, the moral illusion of permanence. The defendant still stands small before the law, flanked by symmetry, silenced by architecture. The Greeks may have believed that their temples aligned with the heavens, but in truth, they aligned men to the will of other men. Every angle, every arch, every measured space whispered obedience into the bones of citizens. They learned to fear disorder not because it was wrong, but because it was ugly. Before the word tattoo meant art, it meant punishment. In the Greek world, the mark on the skin was not a statement of self, it was a sentence. When the state branded a person, it declared them property liar, traitor, or whore. The needle and the iron did what prison walls could not. They made guilt permanent. A scar could not appeal its verdict. In Athens and across the Aegean, slaves were tattooed with their owners' names, soldiers with their regiments, deserters with the words drapatskis, runaway. Women accused of adultery or prostitution were branded as warnings to others. These were not chaotic acts of cruelty, they were inscriptions of order. The mark turned the body into a walking document. Flesh became parchment, identity became evidence. The state learned that it didn't need to chain every slave it could right. Obedience directly into the skin. The branding was both practical and symbolic. Heated irons hissed against bare flesh, while witnesses watched to ensure that punishment was real, legal, and seen. In many city-states, magistrates recorded the act in civic ledgers, noting both the crime and the mark's location: forehead, arm, thigh. The system was meticulous. To control the populace, shame had to be traceable. Each body once marked became a node in a vast moral network. But this was also a culture obsessed with beauty proportion and purity. To mar the skin was to defile the divine geometry of the human form. That paradox gave the tattoo its real power. The Greeks believed the body mirrored the order of the cosmos. To scar it was to mark one's fall from harmony into chaos. The state weaponized that belief. The iron did not just burn it, inverted sacred order. A mark meant exile from beauty, from virtue, from belonging. For the freeborn citizen, that fear was psychological torture. It meant erasure from the community of the beautiful and the balanced. To be branded was to lose one's humanity in a world that measured morality through aesthetics. Even slaves, though accustomed to servitude, knew the brand as a curse, a reminder that their flesh was someone else's scripture. The word cut into skin was both command and confession. Historians tell of captured soldiers forced to wear inked slogans mocking their defeat. When Athens lost wars, the victorious Spartans branded prisoners with emblems of ridicule, snakes, foxes, or broken shields. The body itself became propaganda, paraded through streets as proof of victory. Later, Rome would adopt and industrialize the practice, but its philosophical seed was Greek humiliation made visible, permanent, and public. It was not only the iron that burned, it was the ink. Some marks were tattooed with soot and vinegar, forced under the skin with needles. The sting carried infection, swelling, and sometimes fever. Victims often prayed that their wounds would scar thickly, hiding the letters. Few were so lucky. Most healed just enough for the words to stand legible and dark like black seals of ownership. To the Greeks, this permanence was both horror and control. A prison could be escaped, a chain could be broken, but a mark was eternal. The scar spoke louder than the condemned, ensuring that shame traveled wherever the branded went. The mark was a mobile sentence, a curse that followed its bearer to the grave. Yet, there is another layer these punishments reveal: the Greek anxiety about freedom itself. The ideal citizen was pure, visible, and known. Tattoos blurred that line. They made status ambiguous. A free man with a mark resembled a slave. This terrified the elite. So the more they feared disorder, the more they marked bodies to preserve order, until the line between slave and citizen was itself branded into the culture. Control, once written into flesh, could not be erased. The irony is brutal. The same civilization that worshipped marble perfection and sculpted the human body into ideals of divine beauty also perfected the art of disfigurement. The same hands that carved statues of gods also carved obedience into men. Ink and fire were not opposites of beauty. They were its dark reflection. When the brand cooled and the wound crusted over the victim's body no longer belonged to themselves, it belonged to the system that had written its will into them. They became both proof and warning, walking reminders that in a world ruled by perfection, imperfection was treason. Punishment in ancient Greece did not end with the magistrate's verdict. It began there. The true sentence was not confinement or pain, it was performance. When a body was brought into the Agora, the city's open heart, the stage was set. Merchants paused their trading. Children climbed on steps. Philosophers turned their gaze from reason to spectacle. The condemned became an exhibit in the moral theatre of democracy. The Greeks believed that citizenship required participation in governance, in debate, and most disturbingly, in punishment. Public disgrace was the mechanism through which the community rehearsed its own virtue. A woman stripped for adultery, a debtor flogged a slave tattooed before a crowd. These scenes reminded every spectator that order was maintained not by law alone, but by their eyes, their voices, and their laughter. The people were not witnesses. They were collaborators. The ritual followed a choreography. Guards dragged the accused through the square, announcing their crimes in measured tones. The crowd's response was not spontaneous rage, it was expected. Jeers, mockery, spitting, all were civic duties. Even the insults had categories. Women were mocked for lust, men for cowardice, slaves for deceit. The Agora, meant as the birthplace of philosophy and free speech, doubled as the arena of humiliation. In the center stood the post of exposure, a column darkened by sweat, blood, and time. There under the sun, the condemned was bound. Punishment became lesson, pain became policy. The heat blistered the skin, the dust settled into wounds, and yet the greater torment was the gaze, hundreds of eyes measuring worth, condemning imperfection. Shame was the true executioner. This public theatre served a deeper function than justice. It was moral engineering. By watching another's fall, citizens learned to police themselves. The body on display was not an individual, but a mirror. Each viewer rehearsed obedience in silence, learning through disgust what lines not to cross. The spectacle of punishment replaced philosophy with reflex obedience without thought. Records from Athens and Corinth describe these punishments with bureaucratic precision. The condemned were displayed for set durations, 3 hours, 6, sometimes a full day, depending on the gravity of their dishonor. Some cities measured exposure by the shadow of the sun, from its rising to its peak. The sinner's body served as sundial of shame. The formula was exact, as if pain could be quantified into civic balance. What made this system terrifying was not its violence, but its efficiency. The state needed no permanent prisons, no vast armies of enforcers. The crowd itself was the mechanism. Each citizen became a custodian of moral order, their participation transforming cruelty into duty. It was democracy weaponized against empathy. Even the philosophers who preached moderation and virtue did not challenge the ritual's logic. They saw it as pedagogy, a visual lesson in civic harmony. Plato wrote that citizens must learn through the correction of others. Aristotle called public disgrace the surgery of the soul. It was not vengeance, they said, but education. Thus, cruelty hid behind the vocabulary of virtue. But the deeper psychology ran darker still. To mock the condemned was to reassure oneself of belonging. The crowd's jeering was self-preservation. Every laugh was a whispered relief. It's them, not me. The Agora turned citizens into accomplices, and accomplices into believers. By participating in humiliation, they protected their fragile sense of innocence. The empire of shame sustained itself, not through fear alone, but through complicity. The spectacle always ended the same way: silence. As the crowd dispersed and the condemned collapsed, the space returned to normalcy. Stalls reopened, debates resumed. Children played where the punished had wept. The stain of cruelty was absorbed into daily life. It was no longer seen as cruelty at all, only as order. In that normalization lay the genius and horror of the Greek system. By blending punishment with participation, they created obedience without oppression, control without armies. Shame policed more efficiently than steel. The lash struck once, the gaze lingered forever. This was the birth of civic cruelty punishment, not imposed upon the people, but enacted by them through ritual repetition and spectacle. In the Greek world, intelligence was supposed to be the shield of the powerful, the scholar, the scribe, the speaker. These were not soldiers, but architects of order. Yet, even they could not escape the reach of humiliation. The pen that served the police could also betray it, and when it did, the punishment was not death. It was erasure, both physical and symbolic. One Athenian account tells of a city clerk, a grammateus, accused of falsifying the ledgers of tribute. The court did not hang him. That would have been too merciful. Instead, they broke his hands, his tools, his purpose, his dignity. The scene was not private. He was brought to the steps of the archive where he had once served, and there, in front of his colleagues, the magistrate ordered the punishment. His hands were placed on the marble bench. The hammer fell. Bones cracked, echoing against the same walls that had once echoed with his writing. He screamed, not only from pain, but from the realization that his identity had been destroyed. His body was no longer an instrument of knowledge, only a record of its betrayal. This was the genius of Greek justice. Every punishment matched the profession. The merchant fined the soldier, flogged the scribe, disfigured. Law was moral theatre punishment tailored to symbolize cosmic balance. The idea was simple order restores itself through poetic violence. But beneath the poetry lay control. By turning intellect into spectacle, the polis taught that no skill, no wit, no education could place a man above shame. Slaves learned this lesson daily. Their literacy, if they were allowed, it was both gift and danger. A literate slave could record trade, compose letters, even manage accounts. But if they used that skill for deceit, the punishment was permanent. Branding their master's name burned into their forehead or hands. The mark declared that the mind behind those eyes did not belong to itself. Knowledge was property, and so were those who possessed it. Some slaves were forced to write their own sentences literally. They inked their confession or the name of their owner upon their own skin, guided by the magistrate's command. The ritual blurred every line. Intellect as tool body, as document shame, as signature. It was bureaucracy turned inward, the state, inscribing its will not on tablets, but on flesh. And the educated freeborn were no safer. Philosophers who defied civic norms, those who questioned the moral order, found their reputations executed long before their bodies. Ostracism functioned as the intellectual's crucifixion. The polis did not need to kill its thinkers. It simply erased them from the conversation. To be silenced was to vanish while living. In the democracy that prized rhetoric, losing one's voice was the most exquisite punishment of all. Greek art immortalized these hierarchies without intending to. Vase paintings show scribes with scrolls, slaves with styluses, each marked by posture, head, bowed hands, extended. Even in representation, intellect was bound. The tools of thought, reed pens, wax tablets, became symbols of submission. The world that gave birth to philosophy also created the first bureaucracy of humiliation. The metaphor extended further. The Greeks called a writing stylus, a kalamos, literally reed. When the scribe's hands were broken, he became the broken reed. The phrase survived in poetry and drama as an image of betrayal, of something once supple turned useless. The irony was cruelly circular. A man who had spent his life translating thought into words became a word himself, a proverb for failure. Behind every act of punishment lay a philosophy. Obedience was not natural. It had to be learned. Shame was the curriculum, the body, the chalkboard. Every broken hand, every branded slave, every silenced philosopher became a lesson written in living text. The Greeks did not invent cruelty, but they refined it into pedagogy. For them, the greatest danger was not rebellion. It was thought unaligned with the polis. A mind that questioned order was a contagion. The punishment of scribes and scholars was therefore not only punitive, but preventative. Break the hands, and you break the future. And yet, there is a darker paradox. The same culture that broke its thinkers also built the foundation of Western reason. Its philosophy survived precisely because its thinkers suffered within the machine they described. The crack of the hammer on bone, the hiss of iron on skin. These sounds echo through history as the rhythm beneath every civilization that calls itself rational. To study Greek philosophy without studying Greek punishment is to read only half the sentence. The body was always the punctuation mark. There was no greater contradiction in ancient Greece than this, a civilization that worshipped goddesses, Aphrodite. Athena Demeter also perfected the public ritual of stripping women bare. The same hands that carved marble visions of divine femininity were the ones that tore the robes from mortal women accused of impurity. To accuse a woman was to accuse the body itself. And in Greece, that body was never hers to keep. The ritual began long before the punishment. A whisper, a rumor, a complaint from a husband or guardian, that was all it took. In a world where modesty was law, suspicion was already guilt. When a woman was accused of adultery, her trial was not held behind walls, but under the open gaze of the city. The Agora, that sacred marketplace of ideas, became her courtroom. There was no jury of peers, only spectators. The magistrate would announce her crime in the same tone he used for tax disputes or trade decrees, because in Athens, morality was part of the economy. Her shame would be public property. She was led to the center where the same sun that blessed harvests now scorched her skin. Her clothes were torn, sometimes methodically, sometimes violently, leaving her half naked before the crowd. The exposure was deliberate. The punishment was not designed to hurt her body, but to display it. The body was both evidence and sentence. To be seen was to be condemned. The next act was the shaving, an ancient, almost sacred form of desecration. Hair to the Greeks was not vanity, it was identity. Women's braids symbolized chastity and order offerings to the gods themselves. When a woman's hair was cut away, it was a ritual of erasure. The blade slid through her locks with the sound of silk tearing, and with each strand that fell, so did her place in society. Once her head was bare, she was no longer wife or citizen, only spectacle. Crowds gathered not out of bloodlust, but out of moral duty. They believed they were defending the polis by watching. Children pointed. Women averted their eyes, men smirked behind the safety of righteousness. The crowd didn't need to shout. Its silence was worse. It was the silence of collective complicity, a moral consensus that humiliation could cleanse. The woman's tears weren't merely her own grief. They were an offering to the city's conscience. Philosophers justified it with language elegant enough to disguise cruelty. Aristotle wrote that order requires the visible correction of disorder. Theologians later called shame a moral purification. In practice, it was political control. The punishment of one woman disciplined all women. The threat of exposure became the invisible architecture of obedience. No prison could contain so many, but fear could. Afterward, the condemned woman often wandered the city with her head uncovered, a living warning. In the bathhouses, markets, and temples, her bald scalp gleamed like a brand. The wound wasn't physical, it was social. For months, she would carry her humiliation like a shadow. The Greeks didn't need chains, they built cages out of reputation. And yet the punishment had its rituals of symmetry. The state claimed it was protecting virtue, but what it truly guarded was hierarchy. The public unveiling of women was a mirror image of the festivals honoring goddesses. Both demanded exposure, both drew crowds, both turned the female body into public theatre. But one was worship, the other annihilation. In Athens, holiness and humiliation shared the same stage. There were moments of rebellion, though faint and rare. Some women historians note shaved their own heads before the punishment could be decreed, an act of defiance wrapped in surrender. If the city demanded her shame, she would give it freely, denying it the pleasure of spectacle. These gestures recorded only in passing hint at a silent war between public order and private dignity. But what endures most is the paradox. The Greeks could imagine divine women who ruled heavens, yet they could not allow mortal women to rule their own flesh. Their temples were adorned with the perfect female form carved in stone, cold, timeless, voiceless, while the living women below were stripped of voice, beauty, and identity. This was the theology of control, to worship the image while destroying the original. The gods were safe, the women were not. Death in ancient Greece was not the end. What mattered most was remembrance, the continuity of name, story, and honor. To die was human. To be forgotten was divine punishment. The gravest sentence, therefore, was not execution, but erasure. The Greeks called it atimia, dishonor, a condition that could reach beyond life itself. The state could not only strip you of citizenship, but of existence. And unlike the lash or the noose, this punishment did not fade. It endured in stone. When a citizen was condemned for sacrilege, treason, or moral disgrace, their name was not spoken again. It was carved away. Chisels scraped across tombs, breaking the marble where the letters once stood. The sound, that slow, deliberate rasp, was not destructional, but ceremony. The eraser's rhythm was the pulse of civic purification. The polis was cleaning itself of contamination, one syllable at a time. Archaeologists still find these mutilated inscriptions, epitaphs that end midline dedications, where only the verbs remain. You can feel the violence in the stone itself, a trembling surface where identity used to live. Some chisel marks go deep, gouging through layers of centuries, as if even the dust of memory were dangerous. Each deletion was an act of statecraft. To be forgotten was not an accident, it was policy. This practice extended beyond graves. Statues too were subjected to ritual annihilation. The condemned's nose chipped off their eyes, carved out their nameplate, replaced with new text. A stone body that once embodied civic pride became a scar, an artifact of collective amnesia. Sometimes the city left the mutilated figures standing deliberately disfigured as warnings. The message was clear. Power can edit history. It was a quiet cruelty. No blood, no screams, only silence. But this silence was louder than death itself. Families of the condemned were forbidden to mourn publicly. To weep for the forgotten was to challenge the city's decree. Some families risked it anyway. They carved secret initials behind tombs, hid tokens of remembrance beneath offerings. These hidden gestures were the underground resistance of memory. They remind us that remembrance too can be rebellion. The moral logic behind erasure was immaculate in its simplicity. If shame was contamination, then deletion was purification. The Greeks believed the city's moral health required periodic cleansing, the way a sculptor chips away imperfections from marble. Every name erased was a restoration of order. They treated history as a living sculpture and memory as something the state could shape at will. But the more the Greeks perfected this ritual of forgetting, the more they revealed their fear. Fear of dissent, of imperfection, of the dead, who might still speak through memory. A statue's missing face was not merely an aesthetic wound, it was a declaration of anxiety, a confession that even in death, reputation could rebel. The irony runs deep. This was a culture obsessed with immortality. Through fame, the same people who built the epics of Homer, who carved heroes into marble, who taught that the highest virtue was to be remembered. And yet the same chisel that carved heroes could unmake them. Memory was both reward and weapon. Even philosophers were not safe from this logic. The name of Anaxagoras, accused of impiety, for saying the sun was not a god, but a stone, was removed from the public rolls. His ideas survived, but his civic identity was erased. Socrates, condemned later for corrupting the youth, avoided erasure only because his name was too large to destroy. Others were not so fortunate. The smaller the man, the easier the deletion. In this, Greece foreshadowed every empire that would follow. To erase a name is to murder twice. First the body, then the legacy. Modern tyrannies would borrow the same technique. The photo cropped the book, redacted the monument, renamed. Each act begins in the same place, the conviction that power owns memory. But history betrays the erasers. Archaeologists today read what was meant to vanish. Under angled light, the faint traces of carved letters reappear, spectral words fighting their way back to visibility. Even when language fails, the scars endure. You can still run your fingers across the ghost of a name and feel the defiance that stone remembers. In the end, the Greeks failed to realize one thing: forgetting is never perfect. Every silence contains a shadow. Every absence leaves an outline. The erased become the negative image of the civilization that condemned them, proof that power fears remembrance more than rebellion. Every civilization performs its power. The Greeks perfected theirs on a stage. Not the marble theatres of tragedy and comedy, but the moral amphitheatre of daily life, where shame and spectacle governed the soul. What law could not compel humiliation could. The citizens of Athens did not fear prisons. They feared exposure. They feared the gaze of others more than the gods themselves. The Greeks called it eidos, a word that meant both shame and reverence. It was a paradox. The feeling that kept you virtuous also kept you enslaved to opinion. Eidos was the invisible policeman of the police. You did not obey because you were watched by soldiers, but because you were watched by everyone. Shame was democracy's most efficient currency. The city had no need for surveillance when each citizen carried his own judge within. Trials, punishments, even festivals blurred into theatre. The same architecture that framed Euripides' tragedies framed public trials. Columns, porticos, open courts. The spaces where citizens gathered to discuss justice were designed to be seen. Justice was performance, the audience complicit. When a criminal was sentenced, the act of judgment was never private. The crowd stood in the sun, murmuring approval, reinforcing their shared moral code through shared disdain. In these moments, Athens was not just a city, it was a chorus. The orators knew this better than anyone. A skilled speaker did not merely argue, he staged moral truth. To lose an argument in public court was not just to lose a case, it was to lose face, to lose self. The Greek word for reputation, doxa, also meant appearance. To exist was to appear correctly. The man who lost dignity in speech lost existence itself. Thus, civic virtue became choreography. You learned where to stand, when to bow, how to respond to authority, not from philosophy, but from watching others fall. The punished body was a script everyone studied. The unveiled adulteress, the branded slave, the flogged clerk, all were lessons written in flesh. The theatre of obedience was not entertainment, it was education. Even religion joined the act. Temples were not places of withdrawal from public life, but extensions of it. To enter a temple was to enter another stage. Your gestures observed by gods and citizens alike. Rituals demanded precision, a wrong motion, a flawed offering, a misstep during procession, each invited public scrutiny. To fail in ritual was to risk moral contagion. The polis turned holiness into civic discipline. Philosophers later framed this as harmony, each citizen a note in a cosmic song. the body politic tuned to moral pitch. But harmony had a darker resonance. It erased dissonance, silenced the off-key. To be different, too loud, too bold, was to invite shame. The city's order depended on its citizens' fear of standing out. This system of social control was brilliant because it needed no whip. The Greeks invented a politics of performance, a structure where obedience felt voluntary. Citizens internalized the gaze so deeply that even in solitude, they acted as if watched. The Agora may have emptied at dusk, but the stage never closed. You could feel its reach in the smallest gestures, how a man walked, how a woman veiled her face, how a youth answered his elder. These were not customs, they were rehearsals. To be Greek was to play your role flawlessly. The polis was the script, and deviation was sin. And yet behind the spectacle something fragile pulsed. What the Greeks called order was, in truth, fear refined. Fear of chaos, of ridicule, of becoming the next cautionary tale. They called it virtue, but virtue built on terror is still terror. Centuries later, Rome would adopt and industrialize this model law as performance empire, as stagecraft. But the prototype was Greek. The philosophers may have written about reason, but the state ruled through spectacle. The Stoics spoke of inner freedom, yet they lived in cities where the public gaze dictated every gesture. This is the paradox of civilization. The more it refines its art, the more invisible its cruelty becomes. The whip gives way to applause, punishment to performance. Shame is cheaper than prisons and far more enduring. The erasers thought they had won. They believed the chisel could silence memory, that the stone would forget what the tongue once dared to say. Yet centuries later, under the slow patience of light, those same stones began to speak again. The letters they tried to destroy rise under raking lamps, faint as veins under skin. You can still read the ghosts of their names, half carved, half erased, like breath caught between two worlds. Archaeologists call it palimpsest stonework, the deliberate overwriting of one inscription with another. But it is more than a technical act, it is a confession. The Greeks may have wanted to forget their condemned, but the marble never agreed. Beneath the new dedications to the gods, beneath the polished surfaces, traces of the forbidden still endure. Time, it seems, has a longer memory than the state. One archaeologist once described these ruins as archives of fear. Every erasure left a scar deeper than the original engraving. The more the Greeks tried to purify their monuments, the more haunted they became. When the sun moves across the Acropolis, the shadows fall in such a way that erased inscriptions flicker to life for a moment, before vanishing again. It is as if the city itself refuses to forget. Every temple wall holds the residue of two histories, the official story and the silenced one beneath. The Parthenon may sing of Athena's wisdom, but its marble also carries faint marks of the condemned, whose names once shared the same stone. That is the cruelty of civilizations. They never destroy completely. They layer over, and the layers eventually begin to whisper. Even the mutilated statues speak. The Greeks who struck off noses and gouged out eyes did not know that mutilation too is a form of memory. Those blank faces, once meant to erase identity, now stare back with a new kind of truth. They remind us that power, when it tries to hide its crimes, leaves behind monuments of absence. The missing face is not silence, it is testimony. In Delphi, one of the oldest inscriptions found under temple rubble carried only 3 surviving words: "I stood here." The rest had been scraped away. Scholars debate who wrote it, whether it was a condemned priest or a woman exiled for blasphemy. But those words, faint and defiant, survived every attempt to erase them. They tell us more about Greece than all its surviving speeches combined. The condemned still speak, not through words, but through endurance. Archaeology, in that sense, is the rebellion of the dead against the living. Each fragment unearthed defies the perfection Athens claimed for itself. The city that imagined itself the cradle of reason built its foundations atop forgotten bones and censored inscriptions. Every recovered shard rewrites the myth, and with every discovery, the clean lines of Greek virtue begin to tremble. This perhaps is why so many Greek ruins feel both majestic and mournful. The beauty isn't only in the craftsmanship, it's in the failure of suppression. The stones carry guilt. They remember the slaves who hauled them, the artisans who obeyed the names scratched away so the city could remain unblemished. Civilization, it turns out, cannot hide its conscience. It fossilizes it. Modern scholars walk those ruins not as tourists, but as auditors. They measure not just the geometry of columns, but the moral debts engraved within. To study Greek architecture is to study a civilization negotiating with its own ghosts. Every chipped statue, every truncated inscription is a receipt of power, an invoice unpaid. In some sanctuaries, particularly in Eleusis and Corinth, archaeologists have found something extraordinary. Layers of lime plaster covering curse tablets and erased decrees, as though the Athenians tried to bury their own shame beneath fresh walls. Yet when those walls cracked centuries later, the tablets slid free. On them are prayers, not to the gods of Olympus, but to the gods of revenge. Let the tongue that condemned me never speak again. May the name they took from me rise again. The language of resistance, once whispered in darkness, now fills museum displays. The erased have re-entered history, not through glory, but through persistence. The stones do not forget. They endure beyond morality, beyond empire, beyond the vanity of the living. Even the philosophers, who once preached the supremacy of reason, are not spared this echo. Plato's academy lies in ruins, its stones cracked and discolored. In 2018, researchers found graffiti scrawled on one of its surviving blocks. No man erases the past. It was written in the 2nd century BCE, long after Plato's death, an anonymous protest carved by someone who must have watched the same cycle of erasure and rebirth. 2,000 years later, his words feel like prophecy. But what do these stones truly whisper? That power's greatest illusion is permanence. The tyrant chisels the state decrees, but marble listens. Time, like water, wears away the lie. What begins as control becomes confession. The Greeks thought they were sculpting virtue. Instead, they built memorials of fear. Every ruin, every fragmented statue, every scraped tablet asks the same question: who decides what survives? The answer, finally, is not kings or judges or gods. It is the material itself, the stubborn patience of the world. Civilization is loud when it kills, but quiet when it decays. And in that quiet, the stones begin to murmur truths no law could contain. The Greeks built their moral architecture from marble. We've built ours from pixels. Yet, the principle remains the same. What once took place under the Mediterranean sun now unfolds beneath the cold light of screens. The Agora has returned. Only this time, it fits in the palm of your hand. The crowd still gathers. The voices still chant. The spectacle of disgrace has not vanished. It has evolved. 2,000 years ago, a woman accused of infidelity might have been stripped and paraded through Athens. Today, she is exposed online. Her private messages leaked, her face circulated endlessly across platforms. The punishment is no longer physical, but the choreography is identical. Accusation exposure, collective outrage erasure. The instruments have changed, not the logic. We no longer need guards or ropes, only algorithms. This is the cruel symmetry of civilization. The more advanced our technology becomes, the more sophisticated our rituals of humiliation grow. Ancient scribes once etched fines and insults into clay. Modern systems log them in metadata, search results, hashtags. Shame has become searchable, permanent monetized. In the digital Agora, disgrace is a commodity traded for clicks, outrage, and social currency. The spectacle no longer requires temples or juries. We are all participants now, citizens and executioners alike. Social media is not the collapse of history, but its continuation. When a crowd piles onto a trending target, it is acting out the same ritual once performed before the Athenian courts, moral purification through collective noise. Each retweet, each comment, each meme is a modern echo of the stones thrown in the marketplace. We call it accountability. The Greeks called it justice. But beneath both lies the same human impulse to control through exposure. Power no longer needs to erase names from tombs. It simply buries them under the flood of content. The victims of digital disgrace disappear not by decree, but by drowning. Their existence becomes an algorithmic ghost, searchable but unseeable, permanently indexed yet socially erased. The polis of the 21st century does not chisel marble. It edits timelines. The modern executioner wields not the whip, but the cursor. We like to imagine progress as a moral ascent that the Enlightenment, democracy, and technology liberated us from ancient cruelty. But every advance in communication has also been an advance in humiliation. The printing press multiplied pamphlet scandals. The camera turned shame into image. The internet industrialized it. The logic is unchanged visibility as virtue exposure as punishment. In ancient Greece, the condemned were punished to preserve social order. Today, the same principle applies, only now the system sells tickets. Outrage drives engagement. Engagement drives profit. Shame has become the economy of attention. The marketplace rewards moral indignation, and we participate because participation feels righteous. The mob no longer needs a magistrate. It needs a feed refresh. The true horror is how easily we inherit these rituals without question. We watch a stranger's fall from grace and feel the same satisfaction an ancient spectator might have felt at a public flogging. I am not them. That sentence, quiet, private, self-assuring, is the heartbeat of every system of control. Fear binds us to obedience. It convinces us that survival means conformity. The Greeks feared being mocked. We fear being cancelled. The difference is cosmetic. The psychology is eternal. The digital Agora even mimics the architecture of ancient power. The columns are replaced by comment threads, the statues by profile pictures, the inscriptions by status updates. the same theatrical symmetry governs both worlds, a raised platform for judgment, an open space for spectators, and the illusion of participation. We perform virtue, not morality. The city applauds itself for its justice, even as it devours its own. And as in Greece, the most dangerous punishment is still erasure. Online to be forgotten is both blessing and curse. The condemned plead for their names to vanish from search engines, yet absence also means non-existence. Civilization's cruelty has come full circle. Visibility destroys you, invisibility erases you. Between those two fates lies the modern citizen watched, exposed, and afraid to stop performing. Perhaps this is the true answer to our big question. Civilization never abolished cruelty. It refined it into culture, encoded it into law, and finally disguised it as morality. We've replaced the whip with virtue signaling the temple, with a feed, the scribe with an algorithm. The mechanisms have become invisible precisely because they work so well. Control has evolved from punishment to participation. But the stones still whisper. The ruins of Greece and the ruins of our timelines murmur the same warning: no empire, digital or divine, can outlast its own appetite for shame. What begins as justice always ends as spectacle. What begins as truth becomes performance. The crowd in the Agora believed it was protecting virtue. We believe we are protecting democracy. Yet, both crowds across millennia stand on the same marble built over the same bones. And when the feed finally scrolls to silence, when the servers crumble like old columns, the same question will echo as it did among the ruins of Athens. Who remembers the forgotten